Joan Brown, who is she, why is she important? That's a big question, but I think the simplest way to answer it is that she's one of the most inventive artists of the Bay Area. Totally fearless. She was not interested in pursuing a single style or even in the market. She followed her own voice and inspired generations of artists as a result. What's important about Joan's work is really its scope, I think, and her ability to, in effect, declare her independence. And so what I mean by that is she started out influenced by David Park and Elmer Bischoff, who was her great mentor, working in the Bay Area, figurative style, very painterly impasto. She was showing at a very young age, winning awards at 21, 22, 23, showing in New York, showing in San Francisco. She walked away from it. And about 1964, 65, told her dealers she didn't want to be stuck painting one way. And she then went and took a hiatus and rediscovered herself as an artist who painted her life, notably her son, her husbands, her pets. These were not things that artists did in those days. They were not heroic, they were not grand, they weren't sort of ambitious in the great museum sense. But she pursued her own voice and did it throughout her life. Shifting styles, shifting interest to travel paintings, pursued transcendentalism. Really interesting woman, really as a person and as an artist. She began showing, I think, as early as 1956. She's born in 1938, so she's very young. But even in the late 80s, I remember she called me up and said, I'm leaving my two galleries, one in LA, one in San Francisco. She wanted to pursue public projects, which she did a lot of in the last 5 years of her life. And so the gallery system was of a lesser interest to her. She respected our gallery, she respected her dealers, but she didn't feel beholden. She was not, as I said, stuck in a style or even a given subject. If she was interested in something, she painted it. Whether it was her dog Alan, her great pit bull Bob the tax-deductible dog, her cats Donald and Layla. These were and Noel and Manuel and Mike. It was the things that were important to her were her subject, not things that might be important to the art world. Joan was amazing. As I recall, she's about 5'1", I think. Unstoppable. Had a great lilting voice, which I can sometimes still hear. Very, very upbeat. And very smart, very intellectual, very well-read, thoughtful, but she didn't, lord it over you. She was really great company. One of my favorite moments with her was standing in her studio when her cat, I think it was Donald, walked in and sat about 10 feet away and watched us talking. And almost like watching a tennis match. The cat's head went back and forth, and I said, Joan, what's this about? And she said, oh, that's okay, he understands every word we're saying. She was that kind of person. She embraced life, she embraced the world. She had told me in our last visit that she planned to retire from Berkeley and travel. She wanted to go spend a lot of time in India, as did Mike. But she was a really neat person. Well, the late 50s, early 60s, which was her Bay Area period, where basically there are four moments, as it were, in her career stylistically. The Bay Area painting style, which was a heavy impasto influenced by Elmer. Then after a period of 2 or 3 years introspection, she develops a flatter style. Matisse comes in, but it's a little early. But it's really her investigating a different kind of touch. It's not the heavy impasto, but it's still painterly. By the mid-70s, she's embraced Matisse, Picasso, Velázquez was an early hero, and Rembrandt as well. But I think Matisse really is the one that comes on the strongest. So that lasts into the later 70s, and then you have a period really where she makes travelogue paintings. And the paintings get flatter and more sort of, in a funny way, schematic, I suppose. And those, generally speaking, are the sort of the periods of her career. The spiritual part of Joan, she didn't talk a lot about it. She did, there's a great quote, she was talking to Karen Sugimoto for the retrospective catalog, and she says that animals were her sort of entry point in spirituality, but it was something you didn't talk about in the 60s and 70s. It was only later that she was willing to sort of be more overt about it in her work. Then she started traveling to China and to India in particular, and that's where she embraced Eastern religion. And I mean, it's a little far out of my expertise, but she became very, very spiritual. Her work begins to introduce what I'd call sort of non-figurative elements, really interesting sort of just spiritual entities. Or there's a great painting of a fan, for instance, that's all about enlightenment, but it's a fan. I mean, so she became less obvious in that sense. Her relationship with Sai Baba, and I mean, that's how she met Mike. So it was a huge influence, and really I think dominated her concerns in her work for the last, well, maybe not decade, but pretty close to it. Yeah. Joan's biggest influences, certainly in the early 60s, when George Stempfli paid for her first trip to Europe, she discovered Velázquez in the Prado and Rembrandt in London. Huge influence. She made several wonderful portraits of fictional portraits of Rembrandt, for instance, as posing as a good friend at a bar. You know, later Matisse, Picasso. Her son Noel told me that J. DeFeo was a huge influence, and I think that's quite interesting. Not only were they very, very close friends, but he explained to me how stylistically important she was, which is something I hadn't known. Joan went to India in the fall of 1990 to install an obelisk at the New Heritage Museum, I believe it's called. And she brought two assistants with her, Russian tile specialists. And it was interesting because Joan told me that she was quite worried about the lack of technology, and she wasn't sure how she was going to install her piece. The work went smoothly, and they finished early. So there was a museum, I gather, adjacent to the site, and they volunteered to work in the interior, installing tiles, in a room over which there was a minaret tower that apparently was unstable, and it collapsed one day, and the three of them were killed. Joan was 52 when she died. She packed a lot of living in those 52 years. Well, Joan's work is important to me. I think, as I've said, because of its fierce independence and its embrace of the autobiographical without pretension. She would do paintings of her son at Christmas. She would do paintings of her son in the kitchen. She would do paintings of her dogs, of her cats, some very large and very, very ambitious. She painted the Alcatraz swim series, probably her best known, which was a failure. She nearly drowned, and she recorded it. I mean, this is a woman who mined her life, not in an opportunistic way, but just in a very honest way. And for me, that's an incredible example of an artist simply seeing the world, the larger world and the sort of more intimate world, as really interesting from an artist's perspective. Most artists don't do that. They're busy trying to make the great statement. Not Joan. She made incredibly modest statements that are amazing when you live with them, as I have for 30 years now.